Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking a pretty critical examination of a figure whose crimes, well, they didn't just shock America, they fundamentally redefined the architecture of modern psychological terror. We are talking about Edward Theodore Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, a name that's, less a footnote in crime history and more like the source code for the whole genre of domestic horror.
And that idea, source code, I think that's absolutely key here. When we analyze Gein's story, we're looking at far more than just the horrific events themselves back in 1957.
Right.
We're examining how our culture processes evil, particularly when it's baked into the family unit. So our deep dive today, it's really situated within that ongoing conversation, especially with modern takes like the Netflix series Monster, the Ed Gein Story, Season 3.
Okay.
And to really get at the terror he unleashed, we absolutely have to focus squarely on the psychological architect who built that terror, his mother, Augusta Gein.
So our mission then, for you listening, isn't just to recap the facts, that we'll cover those. It's to critically understand the ideological relationship, that's the causal link, right, between Gein's incredibly isolated, tyrannical, and frankly sexually repressed home life.
Yes.
And the monstrous outcome.
Yes, exactly. That link is everything.
We want to show how his specific pathology established this really enduring and maybe often recycled narrative of the mother-obsessed killer, how it effectively shifted the location of fear away from, say, the supernatural castle.
Oh, Dracula's castle, yeah.
And then into the seemingly ordinary American farmhouse. We really need to unpack the specifics of that transformation piece by horrifying piece. Okay, so let's start with the macabre foundation of his legend. When the authorities searched Gein's secluded farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, this was after the disappearance of the store owner Bernice Worden in 1957, the public was already kind of primed for something sensational. But what they found, it just transcended simple murder. It wasn't just the two confirmed killings, Worden and Mary Hogan before her, that cemented his notoriety. It was the sheer grotesque inventory, the artifacts crafted from human remains.
And what's absolutely crucial to grasp here is the profound specificity of the pathology these objects reveal. They weren't just random, trophies.
No.
The bone chairs, the skin lampshades, those masks, the belt made of human nipples. I mean, they all pointed to this meticulous, perverse, and deeply psychosexual fixation on the female form.
Specifically female.
Specifically female. And remember, Gein had been grave robbing for about a decade by then, specifically targeting middle-aged women who he felt resembled his deceased mother. So this wasn't just macabre collecting. It was this compulsive, desperate effort to materially engage with the femininity that his upbringing had so brutally denied him.
Right.
And that immediate understanding that this horror was bred entirely within the confines of his domestic life, his home, that's what made him an instant cultural catalyst.
It's the blueprint, the prototype, really. The source material calls Gein's influence singular on what they term the Trinity of Terror. 3 films, decades apart, but all pulling core elements from the Gein case. They cemented his legacy as the essential blueprint for the psychological killer.
Yeah, and if we look closely at how these 3 huge horror films actually use Gein, the depth of his impact is just undeniable.
Yeah.
First up, 1960, you get Psycho.
Hitchcock.
Iconic.
Absolutely. Hitchcock and the writer Robert Bloch, they took those core elements, the intense mother fixation, the preservation of the mother's memory, the isolated house, the confusion of identity, and they poured all of that into Norman Bates.
But interestingly, they fictionalized the most gruesome parts, didn't they?
Right.
Bates did taxidermy. He cross-dressed, which is a visual shorthand for that internal confusion.
Right.
Gein, though, was doing actual material creation from human remains, driven by a much more profound need for what you called identity fusion. Is there maybe a risk that Psycho, by sort of cleaning up the worst aspects, made Gein's pathology palatable enough to become just a trope? That's a really fascinating, critical point.
Yeah.
I mean, Psycho's absolutely succeeded because it made the killer relatable, almost sympathetic in a weird way, and it confined the worst acts to suggestion and, taxidermy. It definitely paved the way.
Okay.
But then, jump forward to 1974, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chain Saw Massacre. Now, that film leaned heavily on the setting and the artifacts.
Right. The farmhouse itself.
Exactly. It took the rural isolation of Plainfield, the idea of an entire family unit being corrupt, and the use of human remains as macabre home decor, the bone furniture, the masks. And it transplanted them onto Leatherface and the Sawyer family.
So it transformed that isolated farmhouse from the specific location of one man's psychosis into this, generalized symbol of rural decay and hidden American horror. And then finally, The Silence of the Lambs in 1991, Buffalo Bill.
Buffalo Bill. And he explicitly utilized the woman suit motif. Now, while Buffalo Bill's motives in the narrative were tied to gender dysphoria, the physical act of skinning women to create a usable garment, a suit of human flesh, that's a direct, undeniable parallel to the objects Gein created.
It's chillingly direct.
It is. Gein's acts were this psychotic attempt to embody the feminine. Buffalo Bill's character arc served as a kind of modern, high-stakes adaptation of that same terrifying psychological drive.
So Gein wasn't just a news story. He was literally foundational cinematic source material, which brings us to the crucial shift he catalyzed in the horror genre itself. Before Gein, cinematic horror often needed supernatural evil, Dracula, Frankenstein, the
Where the monsters were external, otherworldly.
Yeah, the evil was external, monstrous, often defeated with, like, holy water or silver bullet. Simple fixes, almost.
But after Gein, everything shifted. The terror literally moved house. It moved from the castle to the quiet suburbs, or in his case, the remote farm. The focus moved toward a scientifically explicable, yet still terrifying, mundane pathology.
Mundane, that's the scary part.
It is. The evil became clinical, psychiatric, deeply rooted in domestic trauma. It meant the monster was real, it was human, and chillingly, you could potentially live next door to it.
That is the new locus of fear, isn't it? And it's arguably much more potent. The source of the threat became the familiar environment. The sustained threat wasn't some sudden invasion from outside. It was something that had been simmering, brewing, weaponizing itself inside the home for decades.
Exactly. Gein's isolated farm demonstrated that the family, the traditional institution of safety, comfort, development, could instead become the site of potential corruption and violence. It suggested the deepest horrors aren't caused by curses or demons, but by chronic psychological abuse and enforced dependency. Any modern cultural depiction of Gein, like that Netflix series, has to grapple with the fact that the home itself is the primary weapon in this narrative.
That's a powerful point. If the monster is the product of trauma, the house is both the container and the manufacturing plant for that trauma. Okay, so this intense historical and cultural baggage, it brings us right to the analytical challenge facing any contemporary effort to retell this story. The sources really highlight the necessity of navigating a profound maternal paradox within the narrative.
Yeah, the paradox is tricky. It lies in the two starkly different roles women played in this tragedy, and both roles center on the maternal figure in a way.
How so?
Well, first you have Augusta Gein, the mother. She is almost indisputably the psychological architect. Her fanatical control, her abuse, that was the mechanism that built the killer.
Okay, the architect.
But then you have the victims, Mary Hogan, Bernice Worden, and also the women whose graves he robbed. These were women in the community who became the terrible, awful casualties of that pathological architecture.
Right, so the narrative has to analyze Augusta's tyranny without, in the process, minimizing, or worse, sensationalizing the fate of her victims. Is it even possible for modern true crime adaptations to achieve that kind of balance? Especially when, as the source material notes, the series often tries to offer a kind of meta-commentary on the very sensationalization of true crime.
And that's where the meta-commentary trap comes in.
Right.
And the really critical point for the audience, for you, to scrutinize when watching these things.
Okay.
The stated goal is often, to hold a mirror up to us, the consumers, critiquing why we're fascinated by these horrific details. But the paradox inherent in that is, well, to sustain a multi-episode, high-budget narrative, the series must still engage in the very act of sensationalization it claims to be critiquing.
Because it needs the eyeballs.
It needs the horror, it needs the trauma details to retain viewership. So the critique itself becomes a kind of marketing strategy.
Yeah, that's an interesting philosophical tightrope walk. Is there a danger, then, that in focusing so intensely on the architect on Augusta, we accidentally give the audience a kind of perverse psychological comfort? Like an easy answer, oh, it was the bad mom, rather than grappling with the sheer scale of the destruction?
Absolutely. It absolutely risks providing an oversimplified etiology. A neat little package. And this leads us right to the crucial question you have to ask yourself. Does the series offer genuine, deep psychological insight into Gein's psychosis, rooted in his mother's specific religious fanaticism, her misogyny, her trauma, or does it merely fall back on the laziest, most convenient storytelling trope available?
You mean the cliche of the bleak, ugly Harridan mom? We see that figure everywhere in fiction, like everywhere.
Precisely. The Harridan mom cliche is so powerful, so easy to deploy for narrative length and, let's be honest, prurient interest, that it often threatens to completely overshadow the actual nuanced historical trauma. Augusta Gein was a complex figure. Her actions were rooted in her own developmental history, her own likely traumas, and her extreme religious beliefs.
She wasn't just a cartoon villain.
No. Reducing her to a stock character, a caricature of female evil risks, turning a horrific historical reality into a shallow, digestible trope. And the distinction is critical here. We absolutely must differentiate between the documented historical trauma Ed Gein suffered and the eventual dramatic, often fictionalized presentation of that trauma.
And if we fail to make that distinction, if we just recycle the trope without offering any new analytical depth, we haven't really learned anything from the Gein case beyond the surface-level shock value.
Exactly. We've just confirmed our existing biases about bad mothers, rather than exploring the incredibly complex pathology of engineered dependency and its devastating results.
So this really requires us to look past the fictionalized Augusta, however compelling she might be portrayed, and dive into the specific historical record of her control. Because those details, they illustrate the precise mechanics of the psychological damage. It's a level of detail that fictional adaptations often have to skip for pacing or simplicity.
Right. Let's accept that analytical challenge then. To truly understand the source of the monster, we have to understand the source of the tyranny.
Okay, let's turn now to the historical context surrounding Augusta Gein herself. The consensus among forensic psychologists who studied this case is pretty overwhelming, isn't it? Augusta Gein's lifetime of, well, developmental trauma she inflicted and the enforced isolation. It's seen as the precise etiological source of Ed Gein's subsequent crimes. This wasn't just neglect, it was systematic construction of a dependent, broken self.
Yeah, absolutely. To understand the resulting mental state, you have to understand the architect's blueprint. Augusta is consistently described as a woman of severe, almost punitive discipline. Fanatically religious, profoundly domineering. Her whole life seemed defined by control, particularly over her sons Ed and his older brother Henry.
Right.
Her system, it seems, was designed to ensure their absolute obedience and dependence, while simultaneously teaching them fear and hatred of the outside world, especially women.
And a core component of the system was this engineered misogyny waked right into their religious instruction. She didn't just preach, she actively weaponized her faith.
That's the sort of tragic, toxic genius of her control, if you can call it that. She employed what the sources call religious tyranny. She used biblical stories, which, carry enormous weight for a young, isolated child, to instill absolute fear and contempt. There's a chilling example cited often. Her use of the Noah's Ark story during rainstorms.
How did she use that?
Well, she didn't teach the flood as just a general warning about sin, in the abstract. She personalized it, made it immediate.
Okay. How?
She would apparently tell Ed that the upcoming flood, the one the rain signaled, was specifically coming to wash away women's sins. Women, in her worldview, were the primary source of temptation, depravity, moral danger. So by tying natural events like rainstorms to an immediate, visceral threat embodied by the feminine, she was actively training her sons to fear and hate women as inherently sinful, destructive forces. This was systematic, early life conditioning. Deep stuff.
Wow. That kind of messaging doesn't just stick, it completely warps development. And her contempt, it wasn't just confined to women outside the home, right? It targeted the men within her own family, starting with her husband, George.
Oh, absolutely. Her contempt was a defining feature of the household atmosphere. George Gein was sickly, apparently passive, often drunk. Traits which Augusta relentlessly used to label him worthless, a failure. And tragically, she extended this toxic judgment to her two sons. She viewed both Ed and Henry as basically doomed, genetically destined to follow their father into a life of failure and weakness unless she exercised total, crushing, inescapable control.
And the ultimate tool of that crushing control seems to have been the enforcement of extreme physical and social isolation. This sounds like a deliberate effort to eliminate any external frame of reference, anything that might challenge her authority.
It was psychological warfare, plain and simple, designed specifically to stunt their social and emotional development. The isolation was deliberate and it was extreme. The families moved back in 1914 to that remote 195-acre farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. That was Augusta's strategic choice. She moved them there specifically to flee what she perceived as the immorality and the abundance of sinners in the city.
Wow.
And the sources emphasized just how severe it was. The nearest neighbors were often a mile or more away. There was just no casual social interaction possible.
So she physically removes them from society, and then she socially policed them internally within that bubble.
Precisely. She actively and aggressively policed Ed's attempts at connection. Whenever Ed showed even the slightest interest in making friends outside of the mandatory school setting, she would actively punish or humiliate him. Just think about the effect of this over years. She prevented him from acquiring basic social skills, from developing empathy, and crucially, from gaining any kind of independence.
Yeah.
This sustained parental control, the sources argue pretty convincingly, effectively engineered Ed's social death years before he ever considered physical violence. He was rendered utterly incapable of existing outside her orbit.
That creates a total crippling dependency, doesn't it? If your only approved relationship is with the person who controls you, abuses you, and defines your entire reality, then independence becomes psychologically impossible.
You see it?
It's terrifying to even contemplate.
It is.
So when that single source of authority and meaning is removed, like when Augusta died later, the entire structure of the self doesn't just collapse, it atomizes. There's nothing left.
Exactly. The engineered dependency ensured that Gein never developed a solid internal sense of self or any robust external coping mechanisms. He remained emotionally fixed in this state of, infantile attachment and fear toward the maternal figure. And that laid the groundwork for the psychotic breakdown that would eventually manifest itself in the most macabre ways imaginable.
Okay, so if the isolation was the physical cage, maybe the most damaging, the darkest layer of Augusta's control was her absolute tyranny over Ed's emerging sexuality. This repression seems to have directly sculpted the nature of his lifelong fixations and, ultimately, his crimes.
Oh, this is absolutely fundamental to understanding the psychosexual element of the case. Augusta didn't just discourage sexual exploration. She, as the sources put it, brutally shamed his sexual impulses. She ensured that any natural curiosity, any biological drive, became fused with intense psychological trauma, fear, and guilt.
We probably have to address the specific, really brutal anecdote cited in the records about this shaming, because it feels like the crystallization point of his lifelong aversion to women, or at least intimacy.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about, but crucial. The incident apparently occurred when Ed was around 12 years old. Augusta discovered him masturbating. Her response wasn't correction or even just anger. It was an immediate cataclysmic act of psychological violence. She physically seized his genitals and declared them the curse of man.
Oh my God.
Yeah. The emotional impact of having your emerging masculinity, your sexuality, physically grabbed and spiritually cursed by your ultimate authority figure, your mother. It's difficult to overstate how damaging that would be.
A condemnation that severe, delivered by the person who's supposed to be the source of unconditional love,
Yeah.
it must have been utterly defining.
Soul-crushing.
It was absolutely a defining moment of shame and emasculation. And following this, apparently she extracted a solemn, religiously binding promise from both Ed and Henry that they would remain virgins throughout their lives. So this systematic repression created this deep-seated, profound aversion to sex. It led Gein to avoid dating women entirely.
Instead of seeking real physical intimacy, which was now terrifying and cursed, he focused on poring over anatomy books, trying to understand the female form clinically, academically, sterilely, because the real physical sexual interaction was forbidden territory.
His identity structure, already so fragile, was based solely on obedience to this cursed worldview. So the moment that structure was removed, when Augusta died in 1945, it just ushered in the ultimate collapse.
Yeah, Augusta's death left Ed utterly devastated, rudderless. He had no internal compass because his mother was his compass, his entire reality. This event marks the definitive onset of his most severe mental deterioration, leading eventually to his grave robbing starting around 1947.
And her tyrannizing behavior, the experts basically conclude it caused him to develop this unhealthy obsession, often looked at through the lens of an Oedipus complex, right?
Right. That's the common psychological framework applied. But his reaction to her death wasn't just neurotic grief, it was psychotic. A complete break from reality was starting.
So how did he try to manage this void, this catastrophic absence of the one person who defined him?
Well, he attempted to cope by physically preserving her presence, almost mummifying it. He created what's often called a macabre shrine within the farmhouse. He preserved specific areas, her bedroom, the living room, exactly as they were when she was alive, as if she were still there. He blocked off access to these rooms, sealing them like a mausoleum.
That's not healthy grieving.
Not even close. It was an absolute inability to mourn or move past her dominance. Her presence had to be maintained even in death.
And this leads us directly to that critical psychological concept. His subsequent actions were a psychotic, catastrophic attempt at identity fusion. We need to really explore this. What does it mean for Gein to attempt identity fusion?
Okay, so identity fusion in this specific, extreme context suggests that Ed Gein's sense of self was never fully separated from Augusta's control. Her death left an absolute unbearable void where his self should have been. His crimes, the grave robbing and then the construction of those macabre artifacts, they weren't primarily about sexual gratification in a typical sense, or even
Yeah.
just trophy collection.
So what were they about?
They were an effort to literally and physically embody the lost feminine identity, the source of his trauma, his desire, his entire existence. He needed to become her, materially.
So the infamous woman suit, that vest made of preserved female flesh with breasts and sexual organs attached, that was the ultimate grotesque expression of this fusion attempt.
It was the material manifestation of his destroyed internal self. The psychological analysis points strongly towards the suit being explicitly an effort to, and this is a chilling phrase, slink back into his mother's skin.
Wow.
It wasn't about cross-dressing for feminine expression in the way we might understand it today. It was about consuming the material source of his identity. By wearing the skin, he was attempting to rebuild the self that Augusta's death had completely annihilated. It was a psychotic way of proving he could physically possess the female form he was so brutally forbidden to seek intimacy with.
That is the true chilling realization of Augusta's influence, isn't it? She created an identity vacuum, a void where Gein could not express any psychological need for the feminine or even for an independent self except through this visceral, grotesque, material imitation. He wasn't collecting trophies, he was literally assembling a replacement identity from human parts, consuming the source of his trauma and desire in a psychotic act of recreation.
He had no inner identity left to guide him. None. The feminine ideal, the source of potential connection, had been poisoned, cursed by Augusta. So when she died, the only way forward for the monster she created was to become the architect, to physically wear the external manifestation of the identity he was forbidden to possess. That suit, it's not just a prop of horror cinema. It is a clinical record of a total internal self-destruction caused by unrelenting psychological abuse. Hashtag #outtrio. So when we look back at the Gein case, its significance really does transcend the true crime genre. It's a profound and deeply tragic demonstration of how psychological trauma, rooted specifically in the domestic sphere, in severe isolation, religious tyranny, sexual repression, how that can manifest as extreme pathological violence. This case didn't just inspire horror films, it fundamentally taught us that the greatest evil could be cultivated in the most familiar, supposedly safest, isolated places. It really set the cultural expectation for horror that stems from within the home, within the family.
And that knowledge, hopefully, provides you, the listener, with a necessary critical lens. When you encounter modern true crime narratives, particularly those that focus on the mother-obsessed killer, and let's face it, there are countless variations out there, you are now better equipped, perhaps, to distinguish between genuine psychological exploration of developmental trauma and the easy, often lazy, recycled cliché of the Harridan mom. We really must demand that cultural creators approach the complex etiological relationship between Augusta and Ed with the analytical seriousness this historical tragedy deserves, rather than just mining it for shock value.
Well said. And that leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to carry forward, something building on this concept of the identity void we discussed. If Ed Gein's entire existence was predicated on his mother's absolute control and his most heinous crimes were this desperate, psychotic attempt to physically embody her via the woman suit, how does that desperate material attempt reflect the absolute and total destruction of his internal human self? Was there anything left of Ed Gein, the person, that wasn't merely the reflection of Augusta's tyranny? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.